Oh, howdy all. Grab yourself a beer. It's time for some Path of Exile discussion. Grinding Your Games released a series of game mechanics Q&A answers today. I highly recommend having a look at this entire thread on the Path of Exile official website, and there'll be a link to it down in the description below. But I wanted to just talk about some of the things I found interesting that were hiding in there. And so without further ado, let's have a look through it. There's a lot of just intricate interactions and abilities in Path of Exile that are just not worded very well. And so this was a chance for players of the game to submit a whole series of questions about things they found unclear. And most of these were questions I couldn't have answered before this Q&A. So firstly, does Rupturing, now Rupturing is a Deadeye Ascendancy node that is bleed oriented. Does Rupturing's bleeding on ruptured enemies expires 25% more quickly affect bleeding in the same way as bleeding you inflict deals damage X% faster mods? Does it stack multiplicatively? And so the short version of this is that yes, it stacks multiplicatively, but also expires 25% more quickly works in a what I consider a counterintuitive way. When I saw Rupturing's mod, and so this is something where you can stack up to 3 instances of this effect on a monster, and if you've got 3 stacks, you're causing the bleeds on them to expire 75% more quickly. I misinterpreted that. I thought that that meant a bleed that was going to last for 8 seconds instead lasts for 2 seconds, being 75% less duration. However, what this means is that essentially every 1 second of real-world time that passes, 1.75 seconds of that bleed has passed. That's when you've got 3 stacks of it. So that means it's quite a bit better than I had given it credit for. And that's really the short of this, and that these 2 effects do effectively stack multiplicatively with each other. So this means that Rupturing is indeed a very solid node for any character that wants to specialize in inflicting bleeds with bows, which is a pretty narrow niche, but is a good one, and it makes Deadeye competitive with Gladiator in that Ascendancy niche. So next is an interesting question about the unique item Tremor Rod. So Tremor Rod is a mind-specific staff that is extremely good. It's something that, obviously, being a staff, you can 6-link it, and it causes spell skills that are socketed inside Tremor Rod to be supported by the support gem Blast Chain Mine. Additionally, Tremor Rod allows mines to be armed twice. And ultimately, this is a question about the precise mechanics of Tremor Rod. I've used Tremor Rod in the past on several builds. It's a really good unique, and it's also not all that rare. So it's something that a lot of players do use. So when mines are detonated while wielding Tremor Rod with a max mines count of 20, should the detonated chain be 20 or 40 mines long? Is this dependent upon the rearming time of the mines? If more mines are thrown during the duration of the detonation sequence, will those mines detonate existing mines like they would before they're detonated, or can rearming mines not be deleted? So the answer here is an interesting one. It's mostly dependent upon the cast time of the spell the mines use, although rearming time is also a factor, as is how they're placed. So when they're answering how they're placed, that means the layout of the mines on the screen. Are some of them at the top of the screen, some at the right of the screen, some at the bottom left, or are they all clustered tightly together? Mines cast spells or use attacks just like players do, which takes the cast time of the spell or the attack time of the attack into effect. However, they're front-loaded such that the effects of the skill happen right near the start of this time, so most of the cast time for mines is follow-through rather than build-up. But the total cast time stays the same, and unlike players, mines can't try to animation cancel to skip part of this animation. So once a mine finishes casting its skill, it either immediately dies or starts to rearm. There's a couple of things that can cause them to rearm, but in this case, Tremor Rod gives a 100% chance for them to rearm once. So rearming, just like initially arming the mine before it can use a skill the first time, takes a base time of 500 milliseconds, affected by modifiers to mine arming speed. Only after both of these are done can it be detonated to use the skill again. So ultimately, the short version of this answer is that it is much more effective Tremor Rod is much more effective if you have reductions to how long it takes for your mines to rearm. For your mines to arm in the first place. So that is an interesting thing that I didn't know about the precise mechanics of how Tremor Rod works, and it is a powerful item, but people had felt like it had been nerfed recently. Actually, it probably hasn't been. It's not so much that it's been nerfed, It's that when players have changed around the mind skills that they're using, they're prioritizing skills with longer cast times, and they're also not prioritizing the stat of mine arming time, and therefore, as a result, Tremor Rod hasn't felt as strong. So there's a question here relating to the ways in which kills are applied to, or like in who gets credit for making various kills. I'm gonna skip this one because it's one of the one of the things that I think is more niche. A phase run is an interesting one here. There's a question here about phase run, which is a skill that is a hybrid of movement skill and attack booster. So it's a very short duration buff that can tend to work quite well if you want to sort of role play the idea of I'm going into stealth, then I'm going to backstab an enemy. Phase run is great for that, but not just for that situation. It's also something that has a lot of uses from a more power gamer perspective as well. An interesting little skill gem to mess around with at times. But it's secondary buff, and the way that this secondary buff works is that when you cast phase run, you go into a stealth mode and you move faster. Then the next time that you use a skill, you gain a very short buff, 200 milliseconds, that causes you to do more damage with certain skills. And the question is, does this buff apply to the next skill that's used when you, while you're in phase run, regardless of how long it takes for that skill to apply, or would you need to finish your attack before the buff expires for it to apply? And the answer is you need to have the buff at the time the skill calculates damage, which is ultimately dependent on the skill in question. But basically, phase run is designed to work well with fast hitting attacks like strike skills, and to work poorly with slow hitting attacks like slams. That's the answer there, ultimately. Our next question asks questions about defensive layering. How does physical damage reduction and reduced cold damage taken interact with 10% of physical damage taken from hits suffered as cold damage instead? And here, essentially, the answer is that the conversion applies first. So the 10% of physical damage from hits taken as in another form applies first, and then after that, these apply if they are still relevant. So physical damage reduction, you're not sort of double dipping on the portion of the physical damage that's converted to cold. You're only getting the benefits of the reduced cold damage taken here. You are not getting the benefits of dampening on that damage as well. Here's an interesting interaction that I didn't think of. So the unique sword Ichimonji has the effect 10% increased effective buffs on you. And a question was asked about how this interacts with petrified blood. And essentially, the numerical magnitudes of everything about petrified blood are increased by 10%. This is true of both the positive aspects of petrified blood, which is that 40% of your damage, of damage that you suffer is deferred until later, but also of the negative aspects of it, which is that 81% of that damage is then the damage that was prevented that way is then suffered by you as life loss over the next 4 seconds. That 81% scales up to 89%. So both the buff aspects and the debuff aspects of petrified blood are scaled by Ichimonji. I always forget Ichimonji exists. It's kind of an interesting item and something that can just do some kind of scary things. There used to be a lot more sources of increased effects of buffs on you, and they wound up all basically getting removed from the game because they were too strong. But Ichimonji being attached to a weapon ended up being something that sort of slipped through and remains an interesting and intriguing weapon to this day. Does generic AoE affect modifiers such as the Ignite spread from Beric's Respite? So Beric's Respite is a unique ring, quite a rare one, that has the special mod, when you kill an ignited enemy, inflict an equivalent Ignite on all enemies within 23 units. So that's approximately, I think, about 25% of the width of a screen. And the answer to this was originally erroneously given as yes. However, the answer is no, and GGG corrected that mistake. Now, here is a big one. What is the ailment formula thresholds for ailment threshold formulas for Brittle, Scorch, and Sap, and how do I know the magnitude of the ailment? Essentially, Scorch works the same way as Shock and Chill. Brittle is the same, but the number is halved. And so that's the mod that is the ailment that causes enemies that have suffered cold damage recently to potentially be able to suffer more critical strikes than usual. And Sap, which is the effect that slows down enemies that have taken lightning damage recently. This is sort of in between the effect of Shock and Chill. So it's yeah. Ultimately, that's the way that those mods work. Then they're kind of niche. Scorch, Brittle, and Sap, I've never really found many uses for myself. I know there are people that have built around them and have had success building around them, but generally speaking, I think that Freeze is so powerful that losing the ability to freeze is just such a huge, huge drawback that you don't want to do it lightly. Now, how does stacked dodge, evade, and blind mischances apply when a mob tries to hit an Exile? And also, does dodge reset evasion entropy? So these two questions come together. Essentially, the way that this works is that evasion, this is the evasion rating that you find on your gear. Evasion rating provides a percentage chance for monsters to miss you. Evasion rating is smoothed out over time. The game simply says, all right, for evasion to be useful, it's not enough for you to get hit 1/5 of the time. That's not a useful defensive layer on its own, because you can get unlucky and still cop 3 hits in a row and just die. So evasion as a defense works differently to that. Evasion essentially gives your character a number for, well, sorry, gives every monster that's trying to hit your character, no, sorry, it gives your character a number from 1 to 100 that's set at random every time that you've been out of combat for a few seconds. And then when an enemy hits you, its percentage chance to hit you through your evasion is calculated. So let's say that the number was randomly chosen as 64. If the enemy has a 41% chance to hit you, what will happen is that the first time the enemy attacks you, 64 will be added to 41. That's 105. That's clocked over 100, so it will reduce by 100 and you will be hit. The next attack, you'll go from 5 to 46, and that will be successfully evaded. Next attack, 46 to 87, successfully evaded because you haven't ticked over 100. Next attack will tick over to 128, so that'll be 28 points that sort of carry over, and you'll be hit by that one. That's called entropy by players, even though it's sort of the exact opposite of entropy in the concept in physics and mathematics. But because there's some degree of smoothing of randomness involved, that's the term that players have just given that ability. So ultimately, that is a complex situation. However, dodge is completely random, as is mischance from monsters being blind. And so essentially, these do not interact. If a hit is not evaded, then only then is dodge checked and blind and the like, and layers like that. So what this means essentially is that there is none of the effects that cause evasion to be smoothed out over time. None of those apply in any way to your chance to dodge. There's a couple of other quite niche questions that are worth having a look at here. One thing though that was really interesting: what's the priority between all kinds of explode and corpse destroy effects? Do they all happen at once? Does one of them dominate over the others? And all applicable effects will apply. So this means that if you have an obliteration unique wand providing a 20% chance for enemies to explode, dealing 25% of their life as a maximum life as chaos damage, and you also have a set of Crusader influenced armor providing a 40% chance for enemies that you kill to explode, dealing 10% of their life as physical damage, you will sometimes get both types of explosions from one enemy. Also, of course, you'll sometimes get none. Okay, so there's a couple of questions again about specific uniques. This one though was really interesting here. This again is dealing with a specific unique and a bunch of sort of specific interactions, but it's quite intuitive. It's quite interesting because it covers a lot of questions that just aren't otherwise clear, and I'm glad that this question was asked and answered. So firstly, the question itself: in what order do the effects from Steel Skin, which provides an ablative shield where Steel Skin will block 2,208 damage that you would take from enemies. That's assuming a gem level 20, I think it is. Frost Shield, which provides conditional warding against damage as well. And Jinx Juju, which causes some of the damage you would suffer to be dealt to your specters instead, if you have any. So how do these interact? What order do they work in? And essentially the answer is that any effect that can cause something other than your character to take damage has absolute dominance. So that's Jinx, Juju, and Frost Shield come first. So if you have these, ultimately, Jinx, Juju will come in first, Frost Shield will come in second, because the Frost Shield is an object rather than you, and so it will be next. Then finally, Steel Skin, your character's life, your character's energy shield, and potentially your character's mana if you have mind over matter or similar effects, will then be hit last. So ultimately, Jinx Juju is going to cause damage to be redirected to your Spectres first, because that's you not taking the damage at all. That's you deflecting the damage somewhere else. Frost Shield will be next, and then after that, it's various Aegis effects. So this is effects where, like the Elementalist skill that causes you to have an ablative shield that refreshes itself and protects you from a couple of thousand damage each time. That will be next, and then after that, there are guard skills. So it's a complex interaction, but the key takeaway here is that if you can make something else take the damage, that happens first, and that will stack in a very favorable way with other guard effects. So there's a whole lot of various effects here that are curious. One thing that's interesting here is physical damage reduction typically applies to hits, e.g. Overwhelm. Poacher's Mark, however, applies a debuff that lowers the enemy's physical damage reduction. Does this work with the damage over time component of skills like Exsanguinate or Reap, and also with bleeds? And armor only grants physical damage reduction against hits, but physical damage reduction in general applies to all physical damage taken. You just need to get it from something other than armor. Also important, physical damage reduction cannot go below 0. So that's something that's quite interesting here. That's an interesting little clarification that's been made, and something that I didn't actually realize that was the case before reading this. So there's a whole bunch of other questions that are worth a look through here, about various ways that damage is scaled and the like. One that is quite useful to know. Now, I would have known this one, but I think a lot of players wouldn't. Is damage from traps subject to the penalty from the Blizzard Crown implicit? Your hits treat cold resistance as 10% higher than the actual value. The answer is yes. Your hits includes all hits from your skills, and traps are using your skills, and that includes native trap skills like the various skills that are always traps, like what's the name of it now? Lightning trap, as well as traps that are that are using a more traditionally delivered skill like a trap that's delivering arc. Does armor apply to physical damage over time like bleed? No. How about physical damage reduction? Yes. So that's a clarification of something that was asked earlier, and actually it'd be useful if they put that earlier than what they've got here. Something that's interesting is how life recovery rate as a stat interacts with Zealot's Oath and the Agnostic. So Zealot's Oath is a keystone modifier that causes your life regeneration to apply to Energy Shield instead, and the Agnostic is a keystone that causes you, whenever you are not at full life, you sacrifice 20% of your mana every second, and for each point of mana that you sacrifice this way, you gain 1 point of life. So the interaction is that life recovery does not interact in any way with Zealot's Oath, which is something that I thought was the case, but I honestly wasn't certain about. And then life recovery does benefit the Agnostic in the best way possible. The life gained is increased, the mana sacrificed is not. What level are totems and minions and the like? It is, but generally, this is not an absolute rule, but this is a standard. The level will equal the level requirement of the skill or the support effect that creates them. Now, there's a number of other things down here that, again, quite niche, like how does the Ancient Skull Shield equipped with Necromantic Aegis interact with various things, and it can't be used because Ancient Skull's a helmet. Question about Bane and its interaction with Vixen's Entrapment, where Bane was, when they did the changes to curse skills a while ago and separated out the hexes, introduced the Doom mechanic, this broke the interaction between Bane and Vixen's Entrapment. And because Bane is a pretty weak skill, the interaction with Vixen's Entrapment was the only powerful way to use it, and so this basically broke the skill. This is essentially saying that was intended. Bane ultimately is just underpowered at the moment, in my opinion. I think it's the sort of skill that should get some higher numbers. If it had higher numbers, it would be used. Okay, a number of other questions that are coming up here that are worth a look, but again, nothing that really is essential to discuss. And then there's questions about how does it interact? How does an elemental ailment affect? How does when a mob dies with XYZ elemental ailment on it, how does that apply when you're one-shotting enemies? And the answer is essentially that they don't interact. If you one-shot a monster, that monster is never effectively ignited, except for the fact that it will leave an ignited corpse. But the monster wasn't ignited, and at the moment it died, it wasn't ignited. And as a result, cluster jewel nodes like Cremator, which causes enemies that you kill with your hits while they're ignited to explode. I think it's to destroy their corpses, actually. That will not work. And then we finally have, there's another couple of things that are worth a look. Now, Defy Pain is an interesting effect on the Berserker node. So this is something that's a really difficult to use ascendancy notable, but it's actually, there's an interaction here that I didn't realize that is strong. And that is that, so the Berserkers Defy Pain, just for clarification, because it's so bad that people don't know what it does. It causes you to be more resilient to damage until the 10th time you take a hit. And then when you suffer that 10th hit, you take reflected physical damage equal to your maximum life. Now, you can try and mitigate this in various ways, but most players say it's not worth it. However, I just didn't realize that it was reflected physical damage. I only thought of it as being physical damage equal to your life. And this means that if you are using an item that grants you 100% resilience against physical damage reflected, then this will actually work really well. And there's a Conqueror mod that does that. So this is an interaction that may be worth your while considering if you were wanting to play a Berserker that was actually surprisingly tanky. And so that's something that was, one of those just interesting little effects. Next up is a clarification about the Ritual League unique Black Flame. And why don't modifiers to chaos damage affect ignites inflicted with Black Flame unique ring? Modifiers to fire affect fire DOT, so it makes sense for chaos modifiers to affect a chaos ignite. And this is one of those really convoluted, precise wordings that Path of Exile is famous for. Black Flame does not cause ignites to deal chaos damage. It causes enemies to take chaos damage from ignites. Now, these would sound the same to most people, but in the precise language of Path of Exile, this is a different thing. And it means that the ignite, what your character is inflicting on the enemy is fire damage, except that the monster is suffering chaos damage instead. So this is a sort of convoluted and weird interaction, but ultimately it means that the enemy is taking chaos damage, but you are not dealing chaos damage. And that's the reason that it works that way. Now, we have a clarification about how the Soul of Arakali Major Pantheon Power, 50% increased recovery rate of life and energy shield if you have stopped taking damage over time recently. When is a player considered to be taking damage over time? And look, the answer that's given here is not very helpful. It's just the most basic answer you can give, which is when the amount of damage per second they're taking is greater than 0. However, the clarification afterwards is useful. If a player's regen outpaces the damage, are you still considered to be taking damage over time? What about leech, energy shield recharge, recovery from flasks, and the like? And the answer is pretty simple, that you are taking damage over time. If you're only taking 1 point of damage over time per second, and you're gaining 3,000 life per second from other sources like flasks or life leech or the like, you are still considered to be taking damage over time. And therefore, if that damage stops, you'll gain all of the benefits of the Soul of Arakali's Major Pantheon Power. So that's something that's worthwhile keeping in mind. It's an interaction that a lot of people would intuitively work out, but a lot of people would also think the reverse was the case because you are still taking, you feel like you're not taking damage over time when your life total is going up, but you actually still are. And then one thing that's really important is that changing the source of damage over time does not trigger this. If you need to go from suffering damage over time to suffering 0 damage per second from damage over time. It is not enough to go from a state where you are taking damage. Let's say you're on both Burning Ground and also in a Shaper cold damage over time bubble. If the Shaper cold damage over time bubble expires, but you're still on Burning Ground, you are then treated still as suffering damage over time. The whole time, and so this is, even though one of the damage over time effects on you is stopped, the other one is still going, and so therefore you are therefore considered to be still taking damage over time the whole time. So all sorts of craziness here. And lastly, the last clarification on this is Petrified Blood causes you to lose life over time, which is different to taking damage over time. They're not the same thing. And one of the things that really comes up with Petrified Blood is that because it's causing you to lose life, that ignores Energy Shield as well. So does cooldown recovery rate affect Primal Aegis? Now, the answer to what the person meant to ask here is no. There is no way to reduce the 5-second downtime that Primal Aegis suffers while it's depleted. You're just going to have to wait that out. And Primal Aegis does not have a cooldown in any way. So this is one of those questions that was answered very precisely. But what the person was asking was, can I use the stat improved cooldown recovery to make Primal Aegis regenerate faster? And the answer is no. How does elemental penetration interact with overcapped max resistances? The answer is in the worst possible way for the character suffering the hit, which is essentially there's a whole lot of discussion on the precise mechanics of how overcapped resistances work here, and this is something that's worth having a read of if you're not familiar with those mechanics. And yeah, at that point, I think that's really all of the key things. Does shock increase bleeding damage? And the answer is yes. So a lot to read in there. I highly recommend having a look through it yourself at all the things I didn't cover, because what I feel is the most important things there and what you feel are the most important things there may be very different, especially if you're playing something like Arakali's Fang. Then one of the questions that I skipped over is going to be really important to you. That said, I really like going through these sorts of question and answer things, and something I'd like to see GGG do more often, because there are a lot of other good questions that were raised in there that weren't covered, and there's just a lot of really complex mechanics and interactions in this game. So for instance, the precise formula for cruelty support, for instance, is something that we only know about because GGG provided that information during the spoiler season for the Ultimatum League in response to a direct question on Reddit. And the long and the short of the answer is it's exactly the same formula as a shock would be. But this is not something that you can tell from any of the in-game information at all. Ultimately, though, one question that wasn't answered that I really wish was can we get some sort of universal definition of nearby? That is the one real bugbear that I have that wasn't answered here, because the word nearby means a different thing every time it's used in Path of Exile, and that's something I'd like to see change, because it's probably the single biggest source of confusion. That's all I got, though. If you've got any comments or questions, fire away below. Do keep your eye out for the next time GGG do this, because these Q&As are definitely worthwhile getting along to and throwing in a few questions that you've got yourself.